Hello, everybody. Welcome to Teaching Writing in College. I'm your host, Dr. Tom Skeen. And with this podcast, the driving question is, how can instructors in higher education leverage theory, science, pedagogy, and craft most effectively to help their learners with writing? Very glad to have you along. And just kind of a review of things that we've talked about just recently. One that I think is really important, I'm trying to do this in this episode and some of the episodes I've been doing this summer in kind of a reflection on teaching series. And so one of the ideas I brought up a couple of weeks ago was that teachers are accomplished novices. We want our students to be accomplished novices, but teachers should also be accomplished novices. And so, once again, that just means that, we come to the table with some experience that we can draw from. So we're not complete novices. We're never a blank slate, but then also we're not complete and total experts either. We're not, omniscient when it comes to teaching writing. And so somewhere in between, we have accomplished novices who we have some accomplishments. We have more that we can learn. And so I've been thinking quite a bit about AI. It's been around for a couple of years, but, thinking is kind of evolving in higher education about it. And I'm seeing, policies come out. I'm seeing programs and people adjust, and I'm doing that too. One shortcoming that we've looked at this podcast is that it does have a hard time with context. Gen AI does have a hard time with context, especially if you're just sitting down and trying to write with it. You need to add lots of details that are contextual so that it can do the work that you would want it to do. And then adjusting lesson plans to focus students on rhetorical skills. That's been a big one. And I'll continue to do that as I am working on my own stuff in the classroom. And I'll try to share that as the semester goes along. I'm going to try to take some of my lesson plans that I do, and that may become the podcast since I'll be busy anyway. It may be hard to come up with a lot of, extra content, but sharing what I've done with some of the lesson plans, talking through those, we'll see some episodes there and how I've changed to them to accommodate the existence of AI, I guess is what I'm doing. And then I guess to go along with that, a shortcoming is that, the rhetorical concept that I used to demonstrate how to make adjustments in teaching when it comes to AI was the concept of presence, that rhetorical concept of presence. And I've been thinking about this, what's another really good example of that? And I think proposals are a good example of that as well, because oftentimes proposals need to be pretty specific, and AI can never have the contextual details that it needs. I'd like to do an episode on that at some point, and I'm thinking specifically of grant writing, because grant writing at its core is a proposal argument, and it's about getting things done, and there need to be really specific things that get done, and AI just does not have the capacity to just write a grant proposal. It needs a lot of help from a person. And so I'd like to bring that up sometime too, but that's just another example. Presence is that way when it comes to context. Proposals are that way. Making judgments about audience is that way, and I'll try to bring those in as time goes on. But those are just some things that we've been doing, and just being an accomplished novice and thinking about how things can be changed or what can be learned for us teachers is really important. And so I'm just trying to do some of that. I'm using the podcast to do it too, which I think is it's been kind of helpful for me. So I am enjoying doing that. What can we teach students about writing? That I think also is kind of a central question. I may have brought that up on the podcast before, but this is something that's just always kind of in the back of my mind. And it comes from, I've got the citation over there on the right-hand side of the screen. It's Doug Downs and Elizabeth Wardle's 2007 article, Teaching About Writing, Writing Misconceptions, Re-envisioning First-Year Composition as Introduction to Writing Studies in College Composition and Communication. And that has, ever since I read that, it has just kind of stuck with me. We can't really teach students to write. What we can do is teach students about writing. And one of the things that I like about that is that it helps us think about writing not just as a task or not just as something to get somewhere else, but which it is. I mean, writing is about that. It's about getting things done, I think, in a lot of ways, but it also is a discipline. You can know things about it. And that, I think, is really important when it comes to teaching in the context of generative AI in this water that we're swimming in. It's about learning about writing. And so I think that's really helpful. It was for me, even before Gen AI, just to kind of refocus on, what knowledge can we share with students about writing that will help them in the future. And so that is kind of where I'm coming from when I present what's going on in this particular episode. And so that question, once again becomes, what rhetorical skills do I want students to focus on? Presence was one of them, but how can AI perform with those same skills? That's another bit of learning that I have to do. One thing that has become apparent to me is that students need not only to know about writing, but they need to know about AI, how it works, what its limitations are, how it can reasonably help them in the future. And so what I want to share today is what I have traditionally done in my classes, and I want to start thinking about over the next couple of episodes how or what knowledge students need to have about AI to be able to use it effectively. And so and be able to write with it effectively. And so that, I think, is really important, that becomes part of their knowledge as well. And so I've got to learn it so that I can bring it into the classroom and present it to them and get them thinking about how AI works and what it is. Not just using it, we need to know about it. So here I have a list of things to learn in writing classes, things that I draw from quite a bit. And it seems like a lot, but once again, if we're thinking about writing as a discipline, if we think about it as something that has its own body of knowledge, it's not just treated as a service course, it's treated as a discipline, it's treated as a body of knowledge, then there are lots of things that can be useful to students in the future. And I've done some of these on the podcast before. I know I had a whole series, I think, on genre, if I remember right, toward the beginning of my work on this podcast. But genre, recurring occasion, content, structure, and style, rocks, really important. I think that's kind of how best to understand writing. It really kind of frames it for students in a way that becomes useful. And what I think is going on this screen too, I've got a big list of vocabulary. I'm going to go through them real quick, but if there's disciplinary knowledge, there are things to know, there are names, there's a vocabulary behind that knowledge that supports that knowledge. And I think that's what I'm trying to help my students with. And, once again, I've been doing this for quite a while, but of course, AI adds a curveball to it. But so genre, really important way to frame it. And then content, one thing that writers need, if genre is kind of a central way of thinking about writing, one thing that that students really need, any writer really needs, is they need to have a way to come up with content. They need to be able to have some ways to do invention. And so I like stasis theory for that. I use category definition, cause and effect, resemblance, evaluation, ethics, and proposal quite a bit as they are useful in different assignments that I do. Support, I also have that just there after stasis theory, but any kind of support for any kind of writing that's happening, in terms of outside materials or whatever else. Writers need to have ways to find support. They need to have ways to find content. Stasis theory is a great way to do that. Also, they could use commonplaces. Typical content for genres. Parts of genres may vary. With grant writing, there are different subgenres, kind of like there's a budget narrative, or in journalism, there's, things like angles. And so there are different kinds of writing out there, and depending on what class you're teaching, it might really be helpful for learners to understand that more specific content as well. And so we've kind of got more general rhetorical content, things like stasis theory, or just genre a little more generally, or other invention strategies like commonplaces, I think can really be helpful there, or finding support, outside support or evidence. But then in particular areas of writing, there's also a vocabulary. So there's a little bit more of a granular vocabulary that's specific to the type of writing that's happening, like with journalism or grant writing or other kinds of writing. And then structure, legal writing is another one that comes to mind. For example, lots of them in legal writing, and I'm sure others too, like medicine and so on. So depending on what you're teaching, it's really helpful to kind of know the different, more specific types of content in particular types of writing, particular genres in particular areas. Structure, also a really important skill for writers to have. And one thing that I have kind of seen is that that one seems like an easy one to offload to AI, to sort of do some cognitive offloading. I've noticed this, where, maybe students have been encouraged to come up with or to use AI to create an outline. But that takes away an opportunity for the student or for the writer to develop that outline on their own. And structure can be a really important part of the writing process. And I was thinking about that, and it was kind of confirmed to me by an author named James Lang. I don't know if you've read anything by James Lang, but he may be retired now. I'm not quite sure, but he was an English professor, and he also was an expert on teaching. And one of the books that he wrote was Write Like You Teach. I bought it over the summer, and I've been reading it a little bit, Write Like You Teach. And in that, he's got some different, he will stop and talk about AI once in a while. And one of the things that he said, look, there are these opportunities with structure. And here are some different structures you could use to structure a book, which was something that I thought was really useful. And he just mentioned that, it's really good for the writer to work with structure because it can help them find other things to say. It can help them decide how they want to approach their audience. And that's not something that we want AI to take away. And so really important. But structure is an important part of writing. And so we shouldn't offload that. And so I've got a lot of strategies that I've shared with students over the years. One that I like to call familiar to unfamiliar. I think I did an episode on that, just to kind of show how it works. Classical argument, modified classical argument, narrative, chronology, visual structure, also really important. And I've got a little framework for that. Park, proximity, alignment, repetition, and contrast. And a lot of these, I've found over the years in different textbooks that I've used, or, sometimes in anthologies or encyclopedias like Teresa Enos's Encyclopedia of Rhetoric, or James Jasinski's source book on rhetoric, things like that. Style, different aspects to style like grammar, tone, diction, sentence structure. Content structure and style, those are really important parts of genres. And so kind of understanding how style works is really important because you can adjust your style based on the way that you use grammar or the tone that you take or what the diction is, or sentence structures can help the writing sound certain ways. Dictionary entries sound different from classroom essays, and those sound different from grocery receipts and so on. And you can tell when you're just reading something out loud, you can kind of start to make guesses based on its style, based on how it sounds, as to what that particular type of writing is. I like to do that with students sometimes. Impressions, another dimension of writing that I think sometimes gets overlooked, where it's not just what you say, but it's also how you say it, where you kind of encourage the reader to perceive something in a certain way. So impressions are really important. There are lots of strategies for that. You can control the space of the writing so that certain things get emphasized over others. Presence, also a really important one that we've talked about. Evidence. I like to put evidence under impressions because a lot of people expect certain kinds of evidence, or certain kinds of evidence don't just prove something, but they also leave an impression. And so I like to talk about it that way in my classes quite a bit. Connotations, also really important. Sentence structures, again, in there a little bit for impressions. Penny principle, I had a couple of episodes on that. Metacognition, I think that's important too. I do like to be explicit about metacognition and give my students tools to do it. And so I give them kind of a how-to. If you're going to do metacognition, you've got to be able to talk about the skill and explain what that skill is. You've got to provide an example in your writing of that skill. Then you've got to evaluate your performance or talk about how you use it or something like that. And so since we're talking about writing, we're not saying this is how you write. We're talking about writing itself. That's what the course is about. It's about writing. And so when you can name those skills and provide examples of how you've used them, I think that's really good for metacognition. So I teach that explicitly. And then I like to teach transfer explicitly, detect, elect, connect. Also really important. Sorry, some of the names are slipping my mind. Perkins and Solomon, who of course are very fundamental in literature about transfer. And then learning itself. I like to make that explicit too in my classes. And so I will share from the Elon statement, here's what you need that's going to help you learn. So you need to have concepts. You need to practice with those concepts. You need to practice the skills that those concepts represent, like presence, for example, or argument, or structuring your writing, and so on. Metacognition, really important, and disposition from the Elon statement. And so kind of the attitude toward whatever's being learned. And so I like to work with students on those. I like to be explicit about that too. And then I also say, you know what, this also applies to your other classes, because I know sometimes they're taking classes in their majors that they, maybe they want to do well in those. And sometimes I'll even do class activities around concepts, practice, metacognition, and disposition. And I have them apply that to whatever they're learning in those other classes, just to kind of give them a little boost that way. And so then comes AI. And so, I've got my list here, and it varies in emphasis kind of depending on which classes I'm in, or if I'm, once again, if I'm teaching a course on grant writing, which I do periodically, then I'm also going to want to, I'm going to kind of shift the way that I use some of these. And sometimes I can say, because we have some of these in the curriculum at GCU, like proposal, for example, that's in one of the first year writing courses. And so remember what you did in English 106 with proposals. Well, here's how some of those principles apply here, and then they play out differently because it's grant writing. And so I try to build that way too. But so the emphasis may vary in a lot of these, but one thing that I want to add to my own teaching repertoire here is something about Gen AI, and I want to kind of just mix it in. And it does kind of seem like a lot, because I've got a big list on that previous slide, and now I'm going to add something else to it. But I think there are some ways to do that will work really well, and it may mean in some cases making just little tweaks to things I've already done. Sometimes it may mean, developing full-fledged lesson plans around it, but I think it can still happen here. So things that I think I should know and students should know about Gen AI. One is how AI works, how it generates texts, how it generates text, how to prompt it, and so on. What its strengths and limitations are, I think is really important. And so working with students on that, I've done some of that in class before. Real world scenarios for use and misuse. I think having discussions about that, if something happens in the news, I know I've seen a few different times where, if I remember right, where lawyers have been sanctioned, by courts because they submitted paperwork that had cases that were hallucinated, that were made up by AI. They would refer to cases that were made up. And so real world scenarios for use and misuse, I think, would be really helpful. What it means to write, I think that's important too. If we use AI, is it writing? And that's going to come up in the next episode. I've been working on a PowerPoint for that I'd like to bring in for students at the beginning of the semester. What it means to write. And if we use AI, is it writing? So that'll come up. Perception of AI writing by audience or writer, and so on. I've been thinking about that as well in some material that I'll share in later episodes. One thing I can remember just off the top of my head now is there was a recent episode of the podcast Screen Deep And in that episode, they talked about reading and how using Gen AI might affect reading and writing and learning reading and writing. And so that's going to be really important. And I think that's where I also heard about perceptions of AI writing. I've been trying to collect things that I'm going to want to bring them in. So, but how will somebody perceive you if they feel like you used AI to write that? And so that's a really important thing, I think, for or a really important topic of discussion for any writing course. And so next up, on the next episode, I'm going to have that lesson plan that does two things. It's going to introduce Gen AI in the context of writing, and it's going to introduce my new course policy regarding AI. And so I've been working on a course policy. I'm still working on it a little bit. I want to share that in an upcoming episode as well, because I want to start using it at the beginning of the semester. So I've been thinking through it a little bit. I've got some drafting done. I might not share that next episode because I'm still working on it a little bit, but I can at least share the lesson plan where I would use it, and then I'll share it soon after that. But I think those two things are a really good starting point. And then after that, we can go to some of these others. And once again, I think it's not about necessarily cramming them all in, but those questions can be raised as other things are happening in class, as learning about writing is happening in class. And so that's my goal this semester that I have. So I guess I really kind of have two goals. One is, I want to kind of talk to students a little bit more in a way that hopefully is motivating to them, which I brought up a few episodes ago. I still have that on the burner. And then also this about AI. And those may be the two biggest things that I reflect on, that I sort of work with in my own accomplished noviceship, if you will, as I continue to learn a bit about teaching and about teaching writing. And so that's where I'm headed this semester. It seems like maybe some other things will come up too, and I'll incorporate them. But that's it for this episode. Thank you so much. Here are my socials. I've got email, teachingwritingincollege@gmail.com. Facebook, my Facebook page is Teaching Writing in College. And you can just find me on Facebook, just Tom Skeen on Facebook. Blue Sky at teachingwriting.bsky.social. YouTube at Teaching Writing in College. Mastodon is mastodon.social/@teachingwritingincollege. And so that's all I have for this episode. I hope you are having a good start to your semester. I know some schools are probably starting up in the very near future. And I hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much, and I'll talk to you later.